Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to Lunch and Learn. I'd like to first of all say a big thank you to the United Synagogue for inviting me to come and join you today. Ironically, it's called Lunch and Learn, but today, of course, is a fast day. It's the fast of the 17th of Tammuz. So there is no lunch, but lots of learning to be done. And I'm really thrilled that you've found the time to join us. So I'm going to divide today's class into three sections. We're going to talk about two themes from Parashat Pinchas. And then I'd like to dedicate 1/3 of the shir to the 17th of Tammuz and the 3 weeks, the period that we find ourselves beginning today. So with that said, let's begin. Parashat Pinchas. It's a fascinating parsha, a puzzling parsha in some respects, and something that really needs time dedicated to learn. And of course, the parsha begins with the main namesake of the parsha, with Pinchas. Who was Pinchas? He was the grandson of Aaron, the great nephew of Moses, and he is rewarded. He's rewarded for what? For this act of zealotry. He kills the prince of the tribe of Shimon, Zimri, who had a relationship with Cosby, the Midianite princess, and of course, he doesn't stand for this act of immorality in front of the entire camp. And the Torah describes how he's rewarded with the covenant of peace. Now, before we talk about this covenant of peace, it seems a little bit strange. I would like to invite you to first have a quick look in source 1 on your source sheet. If I could ask Rebecca to just share with everybody the source sheet, we're going to have a quick look at source 1. So this actually is in Parshas Bolak. This is at the end of last week's portion, when the actual situation takes place, and we'll read the English. When Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, right, he left the assembly, he takes a spear, and it's quite violent, and he follows the Israelites into the chamber, and he stabs both of them, and this is where the act takes place. So the first question is, why is it called Parshas Pinchas if the entire episode takes place at the end of Parshas Bolak? And then if you look in source 2, this is the beginning of our Sedra, and it says, Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Leima, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen, Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, Heishiv es Chamosi, he's turned my wrath from the Israelites, he's kind of transformed the situation. Okay, thanks, Rebecca. We can go off that source sheet for a few moments. So it's a strange thing. The episode takes place in Parshas Bolak, yet it's called Parshas Pinchas. And I had a fascinating idea, I believe in the name of Rabbi Leff, that actually, when we talk about acts of zealotry, they need to be analyzed very, very carefully. We need to examine why people do what they do. What are their motives? Throughout human history, we've seen people do things in the name of religion, in the name of God. And how do we know if it's correct? How do we know that their actions are not misguided? And we need to analyze it slowly and calmly and carefully. And that's why there is a gap. There's a gap of an entire week between Parshas Bolak and Parshas Pinchas. We have a week to read what has taken place, to analyze and to think about and to contemplate. And that gap demonstrates, so to speak, history judging what Pinchas did a week later. You know, we judge everyone. It's human nature, rightly or wrongly. But we need to try and judge people positively, and we need to really see the entire picture. So therefore, that's the idea of why there's this gap. Now, there's a fascinating Netziv. I want to share with you an Emek Davar, the Netziv. Of course, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. For those of you who've been to any tribe Poland trips or any trips to Poland, you would have visited the Warsaw Cemetery, where the Netziv is buried. He was a great luminary Torah scholar who lived in the 19th century in Warsaw. And he wrote his commentary on the Torah called the Emek Davar. And he says something interesting. He says, it seems incongruous that the reward for Pinchas for an act of violence is a covenant of peace. Doesn't seem to make sense. Why is his reward a covenant of peace? And he says something fascinating and so relevant over 100 years later to our life today. You see, he says that if we can have a quick look at the source sheet, Rebecca, in source 3, this is the Emek Davar, and I'll read you the English. Pinchas was promised he would not become agitated and an angry person for the nature of the act he did. Killing a person with his hands leaves a strong impression. However, since he did it for the sake of heaven, he receives a blessing that he will always be in peace and serenity. Thanks, Rebecca. Now, it's strange. If you think about it, it's very, very strange. Why is this his reward? You see, Pinchas did an action which needed to be done through the guidance of Moses, through the ultimate guidance of God. But when a person commits any type of act of violence, it leaves an impression. You know, there are many studies that are done that show that exposure to violent video games is positively related to adolescent aggression. It can have an effect on those teenagers or young people or anyone who are involved in violent video games. When somebody does anything violent, that not only has an effect on them through that action, but it has a long-term negative effect on them. And it works conversely the other way. When you do a positive act, that has a long-term effect on you as well. There's an interesting Rambam in the Parasha Mishnayos, in Pirkei Avot, which discusses this concept. You know, if I was to ask you what's better, to put £1 in the charity box for 1,000 days, or to put £1,000 in the charity box for 1 day, what's greater? So the Rambam talks about this idea that giving 1,000 times creates a giving person. It changes somebody to be more connected and greater. In other words, the actions that you do, they have a long-term ramification on who you'll become. And therefore, says the Ha'emek Dover, Hashem rewards Pinchas, giving him a covenant of peace to counteract the negative impact that his action may have had. And it's so true. We see this time and time again. You know, the famous Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, the only female Prime Minister of Israel, she famously said, I could forgive the Arabs for killing the Jews, but I cannot forgive the Arabs for forcing the Jews to kill the Arabs. In other words, through having to fight for our defense, that changes the psyche and nature of the Jewish people. It changes the fabric of the Jewish people. And that's one of the dangers of warfare. It has a long-term effect on you. And the Ha'emek Dover talks about this again in a separate topic of the Ir HaNidachas, the idolatrous city, which we're not going to have time to go into today. And also we see more contemporary examples. Moshe Feinstein, he discusses the idea of is one allowed to set, if a person's home, God forbid, should never know of it, becomes infested with rats, with mice, are you allowed to set traps? And he discusses in Igros Moshe that if in worst case scenario, there's no other way of getting rid of them, you are allowed to. However, it has to be done indirectly. It has to be done humanely, not only for our concern for animal welfare, but also for our concern that if it's not done humanely, that act of violence will have a long-term effect on you. And therefore, this is the idea of the Ha'emek Dover, idea number one that I wanted to speak about this afternoon. Moving across now to idea number two, I want to talk and learn with you the fascinating story of the Benot Selafchad, the daughters of Selafchad. And if we can have a quick look at the verses inside, if you look on your source sheet, source number 5, and it's an amazing, amazing episode that really we could spend much more time talking about, but I'll share with you one or two ideas. Then draw near the daughters of Selafchad, the son of Hefer, the son of Gilad, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, all the way back, right to the son of Joseph. This is really the descendants of Yosef. And their names were Machla, Noah, Chogla, and Milcah, and Tirzah. And they stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest and before the princes of all the congregation at the door of the tent of meeting, saying, Our father has died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of them that gathered those against the Lord of the company of Korach. He wasn't one of Korach's assembly. He died of his own sin. He had no sons. Why should the name of our father be done away with? So they're basically coming to Moses with a complaint. There is laws of inheritance. If I can ask you to just take the source sheet down, please. Thanks. There are some fascinating laws of inheritance in Jewish law, which we're going to talk about. And clearly these women are living long ahead of their time. They come to Moshe, and according to Jewish law, a son inherited their father to the exclusion of their sisters. And Selafchad had died with no sons. He only had daughters. And the daughters come and they argue that why should they be left out? They don't want their father's inheritance to be lost. And Moses takes this very seriously, and he takes this query to the Almighty. And in fact, the law is changed, so to speak, and they go on to inherit. Now, it's an amazing thing, and I think really, thinking about women's rights. Next week is going to be the birthday of Emmeline Pankhurst. She was born in July 1858. She'd be 161. And in 1999, Time magazine named Pankhurst as one of the 100 most important people in the 20th century. It said that she shaped an idea of women for our time. She shook society into a new pattern in which there was no going back. Clearly, she was a woman who was living ahead of her time as well, and she understood the importance and benefits of equality. And her actions actually led, of course, to women gaining the vote in this country. Another famous, powerful woman, Mary Ann Evan, better known as George Eliot. And in her famous book, Daniel Deronda, she has a very positive influence on Zionism. In fact, she was cited by the early Zionists like Eliezer ben Yehuda as having had a huge influence on modern Zionism. She too is a woman truly ahead of her time in the early Victorian age and that worldview of Zionism. And in Parshas Pinchas, we meet these 5 remarkable women, these sisters who come together. And the Medrash tells us something amazing. The Bamidbar Rabbah Medrash teaches us that in the generation that left Egypt, the women put right the mistakes of the men. And there are various examples. The first example, of course, is the golden calf. The women did not want to take part in it. They refused to. They refused to hand over their jewelry. They're really quite sure they don't want to do that. And until the point the men take it by force. Similarly, it was the men who wanted to send the spies. Parashat Shlach Lecha, not the women. The women were passionate about the land of Israel. And we see that so clearly in this week's portion with the Benot Selafchad. And in addition, Jewish law towards its treatment of women is centuries ahead of its time. Historically, the rights of women in Judaism has always been very respected, much more than it was in Western civilization. Women, we're talking thousands of years ago, had the right to buy and sell, to own property, to make contracts, marital rights, which women in Western cultures only enjoyed these in the last 100 years. We know from the famous Eishes Chayil, composed by King Solomon over 3,000 years ago, that we sing every Friday night at our Shabbat tables, how women took place in all sorts of roles, in commerce, in business. Many, of course, of our great prophets were women, famously Miriam, Devorah. And Parshas Pinchas is a chance for us really to recognize this through the episode of the Benot Selafchad, the daughters of Selafchad. And there's an interesting line in the Medrash, and I'll tell it to you in English. The Medrash comments that there are times when an individual can take the reward of an entire generation. For example, Noah. Noah, in the story of the flood, he stood up against his entire generation, and he takes the reward that was destined for them. Abraham stands up against his generation, and the Medrash says he takes the rewards equal to the entire generation for what he does. Lot stands up for the people of Sodom, and the Medrash concludes that the daughters of Selafchad, they take the reward for the entire generation. What do? We know Noah, he fights off immorality. We know Avraham, he's willing to jump into a fiery furnace for his belief in monotheism. Lot withstands all the decadence of the surroundings of Sodom. What did the daughters of Selafchad actually do? What was so great about them? They went to probate court. They wanted an inheritance. What was so noble about their actions? The Medrash explains, consider the times. Everyone's yelling. They've been in the Midbar nearly 40 years. They're fed up. Let's go back to Egypt. It's not going to work. It's not going to be good. We've had the spies. It's really no good. And Moshe is almost taken back by the request of these women. Their interest is one thing and one thing only. They desire to go to the land of Israel. They don't care about what everybody else is saying. They're not interested in the negative reports of the spies. They're not interested in that negativity about the land of Israel. Medrash is telling us that these women were great women, and all they wanted to do was go to the land of Israel. And I think this is powerful. You know, it's an amazing, amazing lesson, particularly as we enter the 3 weeks. We think about Israel, we think about the third temple, and our desire for Israel, for Eretz Yisrael as it was in biblical times particularly. And these 5 sisters, the Benot Tzlafchad, they represent this idea. You know, it's an interesting thing when we talk about the Benot Tzlafchad as well, that Chazal gives them this enormous praise. But the real question really is, what had they actually done well? They wanted to inherit. How do we know that if they were only consumed and concerned with inheritance, that wasn't important? And I had a beautiful idea, and I believe this also is in the name of the Emek Dover, that had they only been worried about inheritance, their father had died some 38 years ago, right at the beginning, before the 40 years, according to the Gemara. So they would have been anxious to get hold of that inheritance straight away. The fact they were doing it now, just before they enter the land of Israel, it shows really what they are about. They're really about the passion for the land of Israel. Okay, so that's the second idea. So we've talked about, the first idea was this idea of the covenant of peace for Pinchas. We've talked about these amazing women, the Benot Tzlafchad. And for the last 10 minutes of today's Lunch and Learn, I'd like to talk about some ideas reflecting on the 3 weeks. So of course, today's the fast of Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, where we fast to remember various tragedies and calamities that took place on this day. It was on the 17th of Tammuz the following things took place. First of all, Moshe descends Mount Sinai and he sees the golden calf and he breaks the first set of tablets, the first set of luchot. It was today, on the 17th of Tammuz, in the days of the first temple, that the Kohanim, the priests, they stopped bringing the Korban Tamid, the daily offering. They'd run out of sheep. There was a shortage. And unfortunately, the next year, the walls are breached, and some month later, the siege by Nebuchadnezzar, and the rest is, of course, history. It was today, on the 17th of Tammuz, that King Manasseh, one of the worst kings of Israel, he sets up an idol in the temple, in the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara says that actually it was also it was under the influence of one of the Roman generals, one of the captains, Apostomus, that they publicly burn a Sefer Torah on the 17th of Tammuz. And even in more recent times, today was the anniversary of when the Kovno ghetto was liquidated in 1944. In 1970, Libya ordered the confiscation of Jewish property, the 17th of Tammuz. And it's a powerful day. You know, we talk about the modern day tragedies as well, but the idea of a fast day isn't just skipping lunch and not eating, but it's reflecting on what went wrong and reflecting on what we can do to improve it. You know, it's a funny time of year. It's supposed to be the summer. It's supposed to be a more kind of positive time of year, but there's always this heaviness during the 3 weeks. What is our objective? What are we trying to achieve during this period? What is the whole reason why we don't have haircuts, we don't have weddings, we don't have music? What's the whole idea of this Jewish tradition of these 3 weeks? And I think the idea is beautifully summarized by the Nesivas Shalom. If we look in the final source that I have here, source 8, the Nesivas Shalom, which I've tried to translate for you here, the purpose and objective of every Jew is that they should have a relationship with Hashem. And this is what the temple was about. Hashem wanted to have a physical home in this world, as it says, and you shall build for me a temple, and I shall dwell amongst it. This is right. B'shochanti b'socham. And through the temple, we cleave to Hashem. The temple brings down to this world a heavenly light from this. The souls of the Jewish people are influenced, and by this, each and every Jew recognizes God and a closeness to him. Therefore, the ultimate relationship with the Almighty is achieved when we have a temple, and when we get close to Hashem, and all negative influences are removed. And when a person is living in darkness, he can connect. And this is what the temple brought to the world. The world was illuminated with this godly light. The temple brings down to this world a heavenly light from this, and the souls of Jewish people are influenced by this. And each and every Jew recognizes and feels a closeness to him. And therefore, the ultimate relationship we have with the Almighty is achieved when we have a temple, and all negative influences are removed. And then we get close to Hashem. And when a person is living in darkness, he cannot connect. And this is what the temple brought to this world. Okay, the world is illuminated by this godly light. Now, it's an interesting thing. According to the Nesiv HaSholem, the whole reason we have a temple is to have a relationship with Hashem, to have a relationship with the Almighty. And now, how do we do this now? What are we supposed to do during the 3 weeks? We're supposed to try and recreate that relationship with the Almighty. How appropriate it is, this Shabbat will be the first Shabbat for so many of us that we're returning to our temples, to our synagogues, trying to rekindle, reconnect. Many people say to me it's a huge challenge. Obviously, the shul environment is hugely different to what we're used to. And being in shul and really being able to tap in. But you know, you look above the ark and there's a ner tamid, an eternal light that hasn't gone out over the last 3-4 months. And it's that energy that we need to try and tap into. But you see, I want to share with you 2 suggestions of how we should try to connect over the next 3 weeks. The first suggestion is the concept of hashgacha pratit. Hashgacha pratit is the idea that every single aspect of this world, the Almighty has a divine involvement within it. If we live our life with a realization that Hashem is always in our life, that everything that happens, there's a reason behind it, there's a connection to Hashem around it, that makes life much more meaningful, and that makes our connection with Hashem much more profound. And that's also leads on to the second idea, the idea of Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name by trying to live our life in a certain way, trying to constantly be thinking at the forefront of our mind, how can I become a better person? How can I be a role model for other people around me? And it's these 2 ideas, these are the 2 messages of Tisha B'Av, of Shiva Sabatamas, of the 3-week period, trying to reconnect and rekindle what we've lost without the temple. I'm going to conclude today's Lunch and Learn with an amazing story. And I'm going to share it with you through a video. And I ask you now to please focus your attention on this video.
It was during the Iraq War in 2003. Jordan Schwartz was sitting on the top of his Humvee in gunner's position, patrolling a neighborhood next to the Syrian-Iraqi border. They were driving through a marketplace that was usually teeming with people. But on this particular Friday morning, it was extremely quiet. Jordan felt this impending doom, like something really bad was about to happen.
We were getting attacked quite often. The attacks were becoming more bold. There was ambushes, there was mortars every day. It was just getting very intense. Every day around their prayer time, the mosque would blare and then we'd start getting shot at.
He was worried about the safety of his unit and his battle buddies, and he wanted to pray that they all make it back home safely. But with no connection to his heritage, he didn't know what to say or how to pray. The only thing he remembered were 6 words his babysitter taught him back when he was just 7 years old.
I was born in Dallas, grew up in a secular home. We moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico when I was 7. Our family was close with the Jesmers, Rivka and her mom, and JJ, or Yaakov, was my best friend, and Rivka would babysit for us.
I ended up putting them to bed, and I thought maybe I could teach them the Shema, and that would help them calm down and go to sleep nicely and be an easy transition for them from the fun day that we had into feeling calm and protected before they went to bed.
I remember asking her why, what am I saying this for? And she told me that it was a prayer of protection.
It is our declaration of our belief in God being almighty and powerful, and that He is really the only force that has any power in this world.
Fast forward, my time in Iraq, as we're rolling through the city, I start to feel like something was wrong. Something was about to happen. And I remember what Rivka told me. I said, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And as I'm leaning in to warn my guys about it, boom! A huge bomb blows up right in front of the Humvee, put some shrapnel on my arm, ruptured my eardrum, gave me a concussion. Had I been standing straight up, the angle of the shrapnel should have gone into my eye. I should have been killed. I knew it was because I said the Shema that I survived.
A short while later, Jordan was back at the base, and he was working on one of the tanks in the motor pool.
All of a sudden, this tall chaplain shows up, and he says, "Hey, are you Schwartz?" And he hands me this yarmulke and the sitter that was Army issued, and he said, "Hey, I found this in the chaplain's box. I thought you might want it." As soon as he handed it to me, I looked up and I was like, okay, I'm listening.
Right then he decided that when he returns from the army, he's going to travel to Israel to explore his heritage.
There was a lot of situations where we had very close calls, and I think my faith, I think me saying the Shema, whatever path I'm on, Hashem has guided me.
He ended up enrolling in a yeshiva. And as he walked into the yeshiva's building, he notices a man who looked familiar.
I'm walking into the base measures and he's walking out, and we bumped into each other. And instantly we recognized each other. I was like, JJ, he was like, Jordan.
It was Yaakov Jesmer, the babysitter's brother. He was going to be his Rebbe at the yeshiva.
We just sparked up a friendship just like it had never disappeared. And then we started studying Chavetz Chaim.
In a million years, nobody could have predicted the far-reaching consequences a young babysitter's words would have on a 7-year-old child.
We do something that affects another person, and we have no idea how and when and in what way that seed will sprout.
It's really quite an amazing story, and one that highlights the idea that I just said, of this idea of hashgacha pratis, of being able to see and understand that everything that happens in this world, there is purpose and reason behind it. I want to conclude with one final idea that's not from this week's Edra, but I think it's so relevant and powerful to what we just said about the 3 weeks. We are told that when Moshe Rabbeinu gets to the sneh, to the burning bush, he's told to remove his shoes. Pasuk says, "Take off your shoes, for the land you're standing on, the ground is holy." And there's a fascinating Chavetz Chaim al Torah. The Chavetz Chaim says something amazing. He says, any time and any place, a person can connect with the Almighty to serve him, to keep his mitzvot. And it's up to every single person to be careful that there should be no barrier between him and his Creator. When a person sins, that creates a barrier. Take off your shoes, as every place you stand is holy. Taking off your shoes represents removing any barriers. If a person takes away the barriers, then the Almighty can engage with them in a very bright and a very powerful way. It doesn't say the place on which you stood is holy. It says the place which you are standing in the present sense. In other words, a person's soul, it's almost like a piece of metal. And the more you wrap it, the harder it is to make the connection. We need to remove the barrier. And that's the idea. The Almighty is telling us that we live in a world where spirituality is tangible. Yes, we no longer have a temple, and it's not as tangible as it was when we had that real presence of the Almighty in Jerusalem. But we still have the ability to connect on the ground that we're standing on right here and now. And I think that is a beautiful, powerful message and suggestion for all of us as we go back to our shuls this Shabbat, as we enter in the period of 3 weeks. I want to thank you all so much for coming. It's been a real privilege and pleasure. And I wish you all Shabbat Shalom. Thanks so much.